The Silk Road was never a road. A German geographer invented the name. In 1877, nearly 2,000 years after the first caravans had already worn their paths into the dust of Central Asia, no emperor ordered it, built, no treaty established it. It grew the way rivers grow, from the accumulated pressure of small decisions made by people who needed something they did not have and knew or suspected. That someone further along the horizon had it. In 53 BCE, Roman soldiers came face to face with Chinese silk on a battlefield in Mesopotamia. They did not know it was Chinese. They could not have known. Rome and China had no confirmed knowledge of each other's existence as political entities and would not for another century. Two civilizations were already bound together by commerce, and neither one knew the other's name. That is where this story begins. The Taklamakan Desert in what is now western China receives less than 10 millimeters of rain in a year. Its dunes rise 30 stories and shift without warning. Summer temperatures reach 40 degrees Celsius. Winter drops them below -20. The people who named it were working in an older Turk tongue, and the name they gave it meant roughly, "You go in and you do not come out." They had earned that understanding the hard way. West of the Taklamakan, the premier mountains gather several of the planet's great ranges into a single knot of rock and ice. The passes sat above 4,000 meters. In winter, they closed entirely. In summer, a caravan moving through them faced altitude sickness, no food, no water, and the kind of cold that arrives without warning even in July. South of the Palmers ran the Karakoram and the full length of the Himalayan wall. No civilization had ever crossed it in force. The interior of Eurasia was not simply hard to cross. Large portions of it were genuinely impossible to cross for most of human history. Rome in the 1st century BCE held perhaps 500,000 people. They lived in rented rooms in timber and brick apartment blocks, bought bread from street, eat stalls, spent free afternoons at the public baths. The city ran on Mediterranean commerce, grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, marble from Greece. What lay east of Partha was, for most Romans, none a collection of rumors. Strange objects arrived occasionally in the markets, resins, feathers, fabrics of unknown origin, carried by traders who had acquired them from other traders and could not reliably explain where they had begun. At the other end of the continent, Han China was the largest organized state on Earth, with a population approaching 60 million. As many as 9 and 10 of them were farmers living in villages of a few dozen households, co-working small plots of millet and wheat along the Yellow River and its tributaries. A farmer in Shandong province in 150 BCE knew his emperor's name, his local magistrate, and the nearest market town. The existence of Rome, its senate, its legions, its marble forums, was simply outside the boundaries of anything he needed to know. Between the time, these two worlds ran the Central Asian steppe, 8,000 kilometers of grass from the Black Sea to the borders of China. The settled civilizations on either side read it as a source of violence. Nomadic peoples rode out of it to raid, burned what they found, and vanished before any army could organize a pursuit. The Chinese had built walls against them. The Persians had fought them for generations. What lay beyond the steppe's far edge, what other peoples, what other cities, remained genuinely unknown to both empires, not as a matter of incurity, but as a matter of distance so extreme it defeated inquiry. A journey from the Mediterranean coast to the western borders of China covered roughly 10,000 kilometers. It crossed the Syrian desert, the Iranian plateau, the Karakoram passes, and the full length of the Taklamakan. No single person made that journey in the ancient world. No infrastructure existed to support it. The snorts terrain along much of the route was lethal for half the year, and yet things oved across it slowly, partially, and through chains of exchange so long that the object arriving at one end bore no trace of where it had started. The first goods to move were not luxuries. Communities trading along river valleys exchanged obsidian for blades, copper for tools, tin for the knowledge of how to alloy it into bronze. Each transaction was local. Each person involved knew only their nearest neighbor in the chain. Yet, the trader who handed over a piece of nephrite jade in a Central Asian market town had no knowledge of the Chinese imperial tomb. It might eventually enter, and the craftsman who carved it in Luoyang had no knowledge of the high mountain valley where it had been cut from the rock. The chain existed, and it functioned without anyone understanding its full length. Jade from the Yarkand and Khotan regions of western China was moving east to the Yellow River heartland from at least the 2nd millennium BCE. It traveled through many hands across a distance of 7,000 kilometers, arriving finally in the workshops of Chinese craftsmen who prized it above almost every other material. They believed it carried protective power, that it slowed decay, preserved the spirit, kept the body whole in death. The emperors who commissioned jade burial suits were drawing on a supply chain that stretched to the edge of the known world. And neither they nor the miners who dug the stone would have described what connected them as a road. Strands of Chinese silk were present in Egyptian tombs by around 1000 BCE. They had not been sent there by any Chinese merchant or emperor. They had filtered westward through the same kind of long, unplanned chain passed between traders, then exchanged for other goods, losing their origin at every step. The Egyptians who placed them in those tombs almost certainly had no conception of China. They had obtained something rare and beautiful from someone who had obtained it from someone else. By the time the thread reached the valley, it had crossed most of a continent, and not one person in the chain had intended that. This was Eurasia before the Silk Road had a name, a continent of isolated civilizations, and each one generating surpluses of goods and ideas that the others needed and did not know existed. Rome perfecting its concrete and its law, Han China refining its iron plow and its civil examinations, Persia administering an empire from Susa to the Aeoni, each world complete in itself, pressing against its own limits, hungry in ways it could not yet articulate. The connections that would eventually bind them together did not begin with merchants or emperors. They began, he says, they almost always do, with soldiers. For most of human prehistory, the horse was food. Communities across the Eurasian steppe hunted wild horses for their meat, extracted marrow from their bones, and piled those bones in mittens that eventually rose several meters high. The relationship between humans and horses on the Kazakh steppe in 3500 BC-ECE was at its root the same relationship humans had with any large prey animal. The horse was valuable dead. The idea that it might be more valuable alive, that it might carry a person, extend a person's range, multiply a person's power, came slowly in stages and changed the continent. The first people to keep horses, rather than simply hunt them, were almost certainly communities in the grasslands of what is now northern Kazakhstan. Around 3700 BCE settlements in this region began accumulating horses in numbers that make no sense for simple hunting. The bones show evidence of corral and pottery. From the same sites contain residues of mare's milk fermented into a drink that steppe people still make today. These people were not just killing horses. They were managing them, breeding them, milking them. A new relationship had begun, though neither its implications nor its eventual destination could have occurred to anyone involved. Whether those first Kazakh horsekeepers were riding their animals is still debated. What is certain is that by around 3000 BCE, CEG, across the broader grasslands stretching from Ukraine to the Caspian Sea, horse riding had become a regular practice. The Yamna people, pastoralists, whose herds of cattle and sheep required constant movement across enormous distances, had made the horse the engine of a new kind of life. Their settlements were not cities but camps, their wealth not land but livestock, their geography not the river valley but the open steppe which with a horse beneath you is ceased to be obstacle, and became highway. The Yamaya expanded across roughly 5,000 kilometers of steppe between about 3,300 and 2,600 BCE, moving west into what is now Hungary and east toward the Alai Mountains and the borders of western China. They carried with them their language, a form of Proto-Indian European that would eventually become the root of nearly every language spoken today, from Iceland to Bangladesh, their burial customs, their lives, talk, and their knowledge of horses. The expansion was not a campaign. It was a drift clan by clan, generation by generation, following grass and water across the widest continuous grassland on Earth. The horse gave nomadic peoples something that no settled civilization could easily counter: the ability to appear and disappear. A farming village knew where it was. Its harvest was in the same field every year, its granaries in the same building, its people in the same houses. A mounted raider could cover 60 kilometers in a day, a strike before any defense could organize, and be gone before any pursuit could mount. For the settled peoples on the steppe's edges, farmers in the river valleys of Ukraine, China, Mesopotamia, the horse-mounted nomad was not a military problem with a conventional solution. It was a problem that conventional solutions made worse. The answer, when it came, was the chariot. Around 2100 BCE, communities in the southern Ural region, people of the Sintashta culture who lived in circular fortified settlements of 200 to 700 individuals, developed a new kind of wheeled vehicle. Earlier wheels had been solid discs of heavy wood, suitable for ox carts, but too slow and cumbersome for warfare. The Sinta wheel had spokes. It was light, fast, and strong, and it changed what a horse could do in battle. A team of horses pulling a spoked wheel chariot could move faster across open ground than any infantry force could run, and carry with it a driver and an archer who could shoot in any direction. The Sinta settlements were extraordinary places for their time. Every excavated building in the fortified town of Arkham contained the remains of a smelting furnace and bronze-working slag. These were not farmers who happened to make weapons. They were specialists. Their economy organized around the production of bronze, our cynical bronze, yet harder than the copper alloys most of the world was still using, and its exports south to the cities of Central Asia. Their warrior burial contained complete chariot assemblies, sacrificed horses, bronze axes, spearheads, and hundreds of arrowheads. The weight of their graves tells you what kind of society they were. From the Sintashta steppe, the chariots spread in every direction. By 1700 BCE, it was in use across the Near East. The Hyksos brought it to Egypt around 1650 BCE, thus shattering the power of a civilization that had never seen anything move that fast in battle. By 1500 BCE, chariots were in use from Mesopotamia to China, and the horse had become the single most strategically important animal on Earth, more valuable than gold, more coveted than any luxury the trade routes could carry. But the chariot was only an intermediate step. It required flat terrain, maintained roads or open ground, a driver and a warrior, sitting in an enormous logistical tail to sustain the horses. Around 900 BCE, a new military figure emerged from the Central Asian steppe, one who needed none of that. The Saiyans, originating in what now southern Siberia and spreading across the steppe from the Black Sea to the borders of China, built a warrior culture entirely around the mounted archer. A Scythian fighter was driver and warrior in one. He needed no road, no chariot, and no flat terrain. He carried his armament on his body and could fire a short composite recurve bow accurately at full gallop, turning in the saddle to shoot behind him as he appeared to retreat. The bow the Scythians carried was one of the most sophisticated pieces of engineering in the ancient world. It was short enough to swing across a horse's neck and over its hindquarters, yet capable of driving an arrow with the same force as a much larger weapon. Its secret was its construction. Layers of wood at the core, water buffalo horn on the inner face to resist compression, and sinew from a deer's Achilles tendon layered across the back to resist tension. All bonded with fish bladder glue and cured for months before the bow was ever strung. The difference we'll see in killing power between this weapon and anything a settled army could field against it was for the period roughly the difference between a rifle and a spear. Scythian bows found in graves along the Silk Road's eventual path in northwestern China near the city of Urumqi date to around 600 BCE. They were buried there thousands of kilometers from the Pontic steppe, where Scythian culture had first flourished, carried by people who had ridden that entire distance. The fact that the Scythians were active in areas as far apart as ancient Greece and the borders of China is not simply a military footnote. It means that by 600 BCE, and the steppe was no longer a barrier. It was a corridor patrolled and navigated by people whose entire civilization was built on movement. The infrastructure of the Silk Road was in its earliest form the saddle. The settled world struggled to answer. Persia's Darius I launched a full campaign into Siayan territory in 513 BCE. The Scythians declined to fight him. Hay retreated, burned the grass behind them, destroyed any food or water the Persian army might find, and harassed the flanks with arrow attacks until the expedition collapsed from hunger and exhaustion. Darius returned home without a battle. The lesson that a mounted nomadic people on familiar ground was essentially unconquerable by any conventional army would be learned and relearned by every great empire that ever faced the steppe. Rome learned it, China learned it, Persia learned it twice, and the road that would eventually carry silk, paper, plague, and gunpowder from one end of Eurasia to the other ran in its earliest tracings along the paths those horses had already worn into the grass. Around 6000 BCE, farmers in the Yellow River Valley of northern China were growing a small, fast-maturing grain called broomcorn, millet. It completed its full growing cycle in under 3 months, survived on very little water, and could be sown and harvested even in the brief warm seasons of high altitude terrain. These qualities made it an extraordinarily mobile crop. A community moving through mountain passes or across semi-arid steppe could carry millet seed, planted opportunistically, and harvest before the season closed. The crop was suited for a world in motion in a way that wheat and barley were not. By around 2500 BCE, broomcorn millet had reached the foothills of the Tianan Mountains in what is now Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, thousands of kilometers west of its Chinese homeland. It had not been carried there by any organized trade expedition. It had traveled through the accumulated movement of pastoralist communities, people following their herds through mountain passes, planting in the valleys where water ran off the slopes, passing seed to neighboring groups who passed it further. The crop moved because people moved, and because a farmer who encountered it could see immediately that it worked in conditions where other crops failed, moving in the opposite direction. Now from west to east were wheat and barley domesticated in the Fertile Crescent of the Near East by around 8500 BCE and slowly spreading outward for millennia. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, wheat and barley were being cultivated at sites high in the Tian Shan at over 2000 m above sea level in terrain that had previously been considered too extreme for farming. The people growing them there were agri-pastoralists, communities that combined crop farming with animal hurrying to moving seasonally between highland pastures and valley floors, carrying seed and knowledge with them across the mountain ranges that separated east from west. The meeting point of these two crop movements was Central Asia, and its consequences ran far beyond agriculture. A farmer in the Yellow River Valley, whose fields ran on millet, could by adopting wheat and barley from the west stagger his harvests across two different seasons. A farmer in the Near East or Europe, who adopted millet from the east, could add a second fast-growing crop to land that had previously produced only one harvest per year. Two crops were there, had been one meant more food, more stored surplus, and more people who could be fed without farming themselves: priests, metal workers, soldiers, administrators. The movement of grain across Central Asia was, among other things, the movement of the conditions that make civilization possible. Somewhere in the heart of Central Asia, these crop flows crossed paths with the movement of metals and the knowledge of working them. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin that defined an entire age, required both metals, and the deposits of each were scattered unevenly across the continent. Communities in the Eurasian steppe were smelting arsenical bronze and casting socketed arrowheads from molds by the second millennium BCE, thus producing standardized projectile points in quantities that only make sense as trade goods as well as weapons. Tin, copper, finished bronze objects, and the technical knowledge of how to produce them moved through the same mounting corridors as the grain carried by the same agri-pastoral communities who moved between highland and valley with every season. What these early exchanges produced over the course of many centuries was a thin but real web of connection running across the interior of the continent. No one had planned it. No government had funded it. The people involved in it at any given point understood only the local fragment they personally participated in. A herder who traded millet for bronze tools at a mountain market. A farmer who learned to smelt copper from a passing group of metal workers. The chain that resulted from 10,000 such encounters ran from China to the AOA and back, and carried within it the seeds of everything that would eventually make the Silk Road what history knows it to be. At the center of this ancient web sat the Tarim Basin in what is now far western China, a desert bowl ringed by mountains almost hostile to settlement and yet permanently occupied from around 2000 BCE onward. The people who lived there in the early Bronze Age were herders and farmers raising cattle, sheep, and goats, growing wheat, barley, and millet, as in making care cheese from their animals' milk. Their cuisine was assembled from ingredients that had originated in 4 different parts of the continent: grain crops from both east and west, dairy traditions that had developed on the western steppe, and medicinal plants from the Central Asian highlands. They sat at the intersection of every major exchange route running across interior Eurasia, and their daily diet was the proof of it. These tar basin communities were in a deep sense among the first people to live inside what would become the Silk Road. They had no knowledge of China as a political entity to their east, no knowledge of Rome to the distant west, but their settlements occupied the natural stopping points on the routes between mountain water source and anyone moving goods or animals across the continent had to pass near them. They were not merchants in any formal sense. They were farmers and herders who happened to live at the crossroads of the world and who absorbed and passed on everything that moved through it. The oldest exchange routes in Central Asia followed water, not commerce. In a landscape where reliable water sources were separated by hundreds of kilometers of desert or high-altitude rock, the path between one spring and the next was effectively the only path. The caravans that would eventually carry silk and spices would follow the same routes that Bronze Age past pastoralists had used to move their herds from winter lands to summer pastures, the oases that would become famous stopping points on the Silk Road. Dunhuang, Kashgar, Samarkand were famous precisely because water existed there and because water had been drawing people to those spots for thousands of years before anyone carried silk through them. By arrow and 1000 BCE, the thin web of Central Asian exchange had thickened considerably. Bronze-socketed arrowheads first developed on the steppe were in use from eastern China to eastern Europe, having spread through the same mountain corridors that had carried the grain. The composite recurved bow, developed somewhere in the Shang dynasty heartland of China, around 1300 BCE, was working its way westward through the hands of steppe warriors and traders. The Scythians who eventually carried it all the way to the Black Sea were themselves following paths through the steppe that communities had been traveling for 2,000 years. The Silk Road did not create these routes, it inherited them. The crucial feature of all this early exchange is the absence of any central actor. There was no merchant republic organizing Eurasian trade, no empire with the reach to administer it, no guild of long-distance traders maintaining the chain from one end to the other. There were only people, farmers, herders, metalwork, warriors making individual decisions about what to plant, what to carry, what to trade, and which way to go when the season changed. The accumulation of those decisions, made by people who had no knowledge of each other and no conception of the larger pattern they were creating, produced across 2,000 years the infrastructure of the ancient world's greatest trading network. The word that best describes what the Silk Road was in its earliest centuries, is accidental. Not in the sense that it happened randomly, but in the sense that it was the unintended consequence of 10,000 separate acts of need, curiosity, and opportunism. A farmer adopted a new crop because it grew faster than the one he had. A metal worker followed the tin deposits into new terrain. A herder crossed a mountain pass because the grass on the other side was better. None of them knew they were building anything. Together they built the mechanism that would eventually carry Buddhism to China, plague to Europe, and print, paper to the printing press. When most people think of Silk Road merchants, they think of Chinese traders carrying bolts of silk westward toward Rome, or Roman merchants heading east with gold. Neither image is accurate, and the great majority of Silk Road trade was never conducted by the people at either end. It was conducted by the people in the middle, communities who lived along the routes, who spoke the languages on either side of them, and whose entire civilization was organized around the movement of goods between worlds that could not easily reach each other directly. The people who dominated that middle ground for roughly 500 years, from the 4th century to the 8th century CE now, were the Sogdians. They came from a region centered on the cities of Samarkand and Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, a fertile river valley bounded by desert and mountains, small enough that it could never sustain a major empire, but positioned so precisely at the crossroads of the continent that it became aim for centuries the engine room of Eurasian trade. The Chinese called them skilled merchants. A 7th century Chinese pilgrim named Xuanzang, passing through Sogdiana, noted that Sogdian fathers and sons planned together how to accumulate wealth, and the more they accumulated, the more they were respected. Commerce was not something Sogdians did, it was something they were. Sogdian boys learned to read and write at the age of 5. By the time they were young men, many of them spoke several languages: Sogdian, Chinese, Turk, Persian, and sometimes Greek. This was a practical skill, not a cultural affectation. Yet, the Silk Road ran through a dozen different linguistic territories, and a merchant who could only communicate in one language could only trade in one place. The Sogdians built their commercial empire not on military power or imperial backing, but on the ability to talk to almost anyone in almost any market, anywhere between China and Byzantium. A Sogdian merchant did not travel alone. He traveled in organized caravans. He often carries goods on behalf of a commercial network that stretched across thousands of kilometers, a network of family connections, trading partners, and established colonies maintained in cities from Chang'an in China to Constantinople in the west. The colonies were substantial. In the Chinese city of Turfan during the Tang dynasty, 29 of every 35 recorded commercial transactions involved at least one Sogdian trader. In 13 of those transactions, that both the buyer and the seller were Sogdian. They had, in certain stretches of the road, effectively become the market itself. What the Sogdians carried was more varied than any simple account of the Silk Road suggests. Grapes and alfalfa moved east into China. Sasanian silverware and Mediterranean coral moved east alongside them. Paper and copper moved west out of China. Silk moved in both directions. For Ghana horses, tall, spirited animals bred in the valley that bore their name, fed on nutrient-rich IQ alfalfa, descended from the same stock as Persian royal breeds, were transported live, requiring water, fodder, and careful handling across mountain terrain that could kill a less hardy animal. By 101 BCE, these horses had already acquired legendary status in China, and the Han Emperor Wu had sent diplomatic missions specifically to obtain them. The Sogdians also moved things that do not appear in trade records. They carried their music with them, a style of performance that became fashionable across Tang dynasty China, eventually filtering down from the imperial court to every level of society. They carried their dance, the Sogdian whirl, a spinning style so distinctive that Chinese sculptors captured it in clay tomb figures. They carried their taste in clothing, cafetans, open-front jackets, tapered trousers, and boots, which became so fashionable among Tang dynasty women that ladies of the imperial court adopted the dress of Sogdian men as their own preferred style. A cult. Yue was passing east, not through conquest or policy, but through the simple daily presence of people who looked different, ate differently, and made things that other people wanted. Before the Sogdians consolidated their dominance over the central routes, the trade passing through Central Asia had been managed on in its earlier centuries by the Kusans. The Kusum Empire rose from the Yui, a nomadic people originally from the area around Dunhuang in northwestern China, who had been displaced westward by the Xiongnu and eventually settled in Bactria, the fertile region straddling what is now northern Afghanistan in southern Uzbekistan. By the 1st century CE, the Kusans ruled a territory stretching from Central Asia's south through the Hindu Kush into the Indian subcontinent, linking, so for the first time in history, the overland routes of the Silk Road with the maritime trade of the Indian Ocean. The Kusan Empire was in a deep sense a product of mixture. Its coins depicted Greek gods, Oman emperors, Indian deities, and Buddhist imagery side by side, minted in the same workshops, circulating in the same markets. The royal treasury at Bram, the Khasan summer capital near modern Kabul, held Roman glassware, Chinese lacquer, Indian ivory carvings, Asen Hellenistic bronzes in the same storerooms. An inventory that reads less like a collection and more like a receipt for the entire ancient world. The Khasans taxed the trade that passed through their territory and used the proceeds to build cities patronized Buddhism and maintain the mountain passes that made commerce possible. Emperor Kanishka, who ruled in the mid-century CE and converted to Buddhism, and spent lavishly on monasteries and temples along every route his empire controlled, effectively turning the Silk Road's infrastructure into a chain of religious institutions as well as commercial ones. The Parthians occupied the western stretch of the same network, controlling the territory between China's sphere of influence, Lewis and Rome's eastern frontier. They were the reason Rome and China never met directly. Not through any deliberate obstruction, but simply because Parthian merchants sat in the middle and had every incentive to keep their role as intermediaries intact. When Roman envoys attempted to press east past Parthian territory to find the source of the silk they were politely deflected. The Parthians understood with considerable clarity that their prosperity depended on the gap between the people they traded with. A direct Rome-China connection would have made them redundant. And none of these intermediary peoples, the Sogdians, the Kusans, the Parthians, appear prominently in the histories written by the civilizations at either end of the network. Roman historians mention Partha mainly as a military adversary. Snorts, Chinese annals, record the western regions as sources of tribute and horses. The people who actually kept the trade moving, who learned the languages, naged the passes, financed the caravans, and absorbed the costs when the routes became dangerous. They were largely invisible to the empires that depended on them. Their absence from the standard account of the Silk Road is itself a kind of historical distortion, a story told only from the ends, as if the middle did not exist. The clearest window into the Sogdian world comes from a bundle of letters discovered in a ruined watchtower on the edge of the Gansu corridor in northwestern China. Written around 313 CEE. They were intended for recipients in Samarkand, but never delivered. Abandoned as along with their carrier when the route became impassable. One letter written by a Sogdian trader named Nindat describes in plain commercial language the collapse of trade following the sacking of Liang by invading forces. He lists the goods he cannot move, the debts he cannot collect, and the partners he cannot reach. The crisis he describes is political and military, but his tone is a merchant's too. Practical, concerned with losses, calculating what might still be salvaged. 2,000 years later, his letter is the most human document the Silk Road has left behind. The Sogdian traders eventually faded from the historical record after the Arab conquests of Central Asia in the 8th century. Many converted to Islam, a pragmatic choice since Muslim merchants had by then taken control of the Western trade networks, and remaining outside the dominant religion meant remaining outside the most profitable markets. Their language died, supplanted by Persian. Their colonies in China, were absorbed. The people who had run Eurasia's commercial nervous system for 5 centuries dissolved into the populations around them, leaving behind a scatter of wall paintings, clay figures, and merchant letters that historians only began to fully interpret in the second half of the 20th century. They were perhaps the most important people most of recorded history forgot to remember. Almost nobody who travels led the Silk Road traveled all of it. The full distance from Chong'an in China to the Mediterranean coast ran to roughly 10,000 kilometers, and a person who covered that distance in its entirety was a rare exception in any century. The overwhelming majority of Silk Road travelers were people who knew one section well, a merchant who worked the stretch between Dunhuang and Kashgar, a caravanserai keeper who spent his entire life in a single building at the edge of the Taklamakan, or Phi, a Sogdian factor, who managed a trading house in Turfan and had never been further west than Samarkand. The road moved its cargo the way a river moved silt through countless small displacements, each one modest. The cumulative effect enormous. The unit of Silk Road travel was the caravanserai day in well-maintained stretches of the route, and as these walled rest were spaced roughly 30 to 40 kilometers apart. The distance a loaded camel caravan could cover between sunrise and the last usable light. The caravanserai itself was, as a substantial structure. Its outer walls were thick enough to suggest a fort. Inside, a central courtyard held the animals. Around the perimeter ran rooms for the travelers, storage bays for the goods, a well, and in later centuries a mosque. A porter stood at the gate through the night. When entry was free in most of the great caravans, the revenue came from the commerce that naturally gathered wherever tired people with goods to sell found themselves in the same walled space. a merchant setting out from Dunhuang westward into the Tarim Basin in the 2nd century CE. He carried with him everything his life might require for the next several weeks. Water was the first calculation. The distance between reliable water sources in the Taklamakan's northern corridor could exceed 100 kilometers of rock and compacted sand. The Bactrian camel he loaded his goods onto could go a full week without drinking and carry 270 kilograms across terrain that would kill a horse within days. A thirsty camel arriving at a water source could drink 100 liters in a single long draught. The merchant's life and his entire commercial stake traveled on the animal's back, and the merchant knew it. The mountain crossings were a different kind of ordeal. On the passes through the Pamirs, the altitude thinned the air enough to make sustained effort dangerous, even for healthy men. Pack animals that performed adequately in the lowlands struggled above 4,000 meters. A caravan traveler writing about a crossing of the high passes described watching a heavily loaded camel collapse to its knees on Deo A, above a gorge, unable to rise, while the men around it worked in silence to strip its load so it could find its feet. The pass gave no margin for delay. A storm could close it within hours. The caravans that attempted the high routes in autumn were gambling that the season had not yet turned. Bandits were a constant calculation. A caravan loaded with silk, silver, and spices represented a fortune, and the routes ran through stretches of terrain where no government had reliable authority. Traveling in larger groups was the most basic defense. A caravan of several hundred people and animals was an unattractive target compared to a small party. The bell tied to the last camel in the line served a specific purpose. If the caravan leader riding at the front fell asleep in the saddle and the bell went silent, that something at the rear was wrong. The sound of nothing was the warning. What the caravanserai gave to the road beyond shelter and water was information. A merchant arriving from the east brought news of conditions on the stretches he had just crossed. Which passes were open, which oases had water, which sections were being worked by raiders, which towns had changed hands since the last caravan came through. This was not gossip. In a world without postal systems or reliable maps, the intelligence exchanged in caravans' orai courtyards over shared meals was the closest thing the route had to a nervous system. A merchant who arrived with good information was a merchant who had something to trade even before he opened his packs. The road changed the people who walked it in ways that were partly practical and partly harder to name. A Sagdian trader who had spent 3 years working the stretch between Samarkand and Turfan came home speaking better Turk with a taste for Chinese lacquerware, a working knowledge of Buddhist hospitality customs and opinions about mountain passes that his neighbors who had never left the Zirafshin Valley simply did not possess. He had eaten differently, prayed in different buildings, slept next to people whose gods had different names. Some of this rubbed off. Over a career of repeated journeys, a Silk Road merchant accumulated a layered identity that no settled person in any of the cities he passed through could quite match or fully understand. The pilgrims who used the same routes as the merchants experienced the road. In a register, the merchants did not. The Chinese Buddhist monk Xuan Zhang left Chang'an in 629 CE without imperial permission. The Tang emperor had closed the western borders and crossed the Taklamakan on foot, guided by a sympathetic border guard, and then for long stretches alone he carried Buddhist texts. His goal was India, where the Buddha had lived, and where the original scriptures he believed had been corrupted in their Chinese translations might still survive in their correct form. The journey took 17 years. He crossed the Pamir, survived the Hindu Kush, studied for years at the great monastic university of Nanda in Bihar, and then returned to Chang'an in 645 CE with 657 Buddhist texts loaded onto 20 pack horses. The emperor, who had since changed his opinion of the enterprise, received him as a hero. Xuanzang's journey is exceptional in its documentation, but the impulse behind it was ordinary. Pilgrims, missionaries, and scholars moved along the same routes as the merchants in every century the Silk Road functioned. And they were changed by the journey in ways the merchants were not wholly immune to either. A monk who had walked from China to India and back had seen Buddhism practiced in a dozen different forms across a dozen different cultures. He had watched it absorb Hellenistic visual styles in Gandhara, Persian administrative habits in Bactria, and Chinese court aesthetics in Chang'an. The religion he carried home was not identical to the one he had set out with. The road had edited it. The physical deterioration of the journey was relentless. Travelers crossing the Taklamakan in summer worked in 40-degree heat. Those crossing the Pamir passes in late season worked in temperatures that fell below -12 at night. Altitude sickness, dysentery, and the liver fluke parasite acquired from eating raw fish at oasis stops in the Gansu corridor were documented occupational hazards of the route. Tibetan army records from the 8th century include specific instructions for treating altitude sickness in soldiers' CR, ossing the high passes. A caravanserai latrine excavated near Dunhuang held the remains of 4 distinct intestinal parasites. 2 of them acquired from contaminated water and 1 the Chinese liver fluke from fish that could only have been caught hundreds of kilometers to the east. The men who used that latrine had come a long way. The road also offered at intervals did something that compensated for everything it took. The oasis cities Dunhuang, Kashgar, MV, Samarkand were unlike any other places in the ancient world. They were cosmopolitan in a way that the great settled empires at either end of the route were not, because their prosperity depended on welcoming everyone. A traveler arriving in 7th century Samarkand found Zoroastrian fire temples, Buddhist monasteries, Nestorian Christian churches, and Manatian meeting houses within walking distance of each other, all operating simultaneously, all patronized by merchants and pilgrims who had carried their faiths in from every direction. The city was not tolerant in any principled modern sense. It was pragmatic. A city that lived on trade could not afford to turn away anyone who had goods to buy or sell. By the time a merchant completed a full season on the road and returned to his home city, he was measurably different from the person who had left. The differences were not dramatic in any individual case. A new taste, a few new words, a story about a temple he had slept beside one night in a desert he had never expected to see, but multiplied across thousands of merchants over hundreds of years. Those small personal alterations were the mechanism by which the Silk Road did what no army and no emperor ever managed. It changed the interior lives of the people it touched quietly or incrementally. And without anyone deciding that it should. Silk began in China as an imperial secret. The emperor wore white silk inside the palace, yellow outside it. His principal wife and heir wore yellow. The knowledge of how to produce tea, how to raise the Bombyx mori silkworm on nothing but fresh mulberry leaves, harvest the cocoon before the moth broke through and severed the filament in and reel a single continuous thread, sometimes over a kilometer long from a single cocoon, was guarded by law. Exporting silkworm eggs, cocoons, or the knowledge of sericulture carried the death penalty. The fabric was so interwoven with Chinese culture that 230 of the 5,000 most common characters in the Mandarin writing system carry silk as their root component. By the Han Dynasty, silk had become a form of money. Farmers paid their taxes in grain and silk, so government officials received their salaries in silk. Values that elsewhere in the ancient world were calculated in gold were calculated in China in measured lengths of cloth. A peasant woman in the Yellow River Valley during the 2nd century BCE spent part of every year at the loom, her output going not to the market but directly to the imperial treasury. The state's fiscal architecture ran partly on the labor of women raising worms. When silk first reached the Mediterranean world, and the Romans had no idea how it was made, the most educated Roman minds of the 1st century CE believed it was combed from the leaves of trees in a distant eastern forest. Pliny the Elder, the empire's most industrious natural historian, described silk as a forest product, a kind of fleece harvested from foliage. He was wrong, but the error is revealing. Silk had arrived in Rome through so many intermediary hands that its origin was entirely lost in transit, replaced by speculation. What the Romans knew with certainty was what it felt like against the skin and what it cost. They paid for raw Chinese silk and gold, weight for weight. Plenty estimated that Rome was losing 45 million sisters a year to the silk trade. Enough, he wrote, to dress Roman women in shimmer at the price of the empire's reserves. The Roman Senate responded by passing laws forbidding men from wearing C.L.K. at all. The fabric was declared effeminate, none incompatible with the martial values Rome claimed to embody. Emperor Aurelian, in the 3rd century CE, reportedly refused to allow his wife to purchase a Tyrian purple silk mantle on grounds of its cost. The laws had almost no effect. By the height of the empire, the silk had become so embedded in the dress of the Roman elite. The Diocletian's edict on maximum prices in 301 CE set the official price of 1 kilogram of raw silk at 4,000 gold coins, an attempt to control a market the state had failed to suppress. The effort to legislate silk out of Roman life ran for 3 centuries and accomplished nothing except to document in law, after failed law, Yasso, completely a fabric from the other side of the world, had captured the imagination of the most powerful empire in the West. Silk moved west, Roman glass moved east. The glassware that Roman craftsmen produced, transparent, colored, extraordinarily refined by the standards of the ancient world, was treated in China with roughly the same reverence Romans extended to silk. Chinese aristocrats collected Roman glass vessels and placed them in their tombs alongside jade and bronze, in a material the Romans produced in industrial quantities, commonplace in any prosperous household from Alexandria to Londinium, arrived in China as an object of wonder. Its method of manufacture is mysterious to Chinese eyes, as cerulture was to Roman ones. 2 civilizations were simultaneously dazzled by each other's ordinary products. Each convinced the other had achieved something almost magical beyond silk and glass, or the car, on the road, carried a catalogue of goods whose diversity the name Silk Road entirely obscures. Lapis lazuli from the mines of Badakhshan in northeastern Afghanistan moved west to Egypt, where it colored the pigments of tomb paintings, and east to China, where it appeared in imperial jewelry. Forgana horses moved east at enormous cost and logistical effort, requiring fodder, water, and handlers at every stage of a journey several thousand kilometers long. Frankincense and myrrh moved north from the Arabian Peninsula. Saffron, cinnamon, and pepper moved along both overland and maritime routes. Cotton, first domesticated in India, spread west through Central Asian markets into the Mediterranean and east into China during the medieval period. Each commodity carried with it some residue of the culture that had produced it. The most strategically important commodity on the road was almost certainly the horse, and the silk for horses exchange between Han China and the nomadic peoples of the steppe ran for centuries and shaped the military balance of the entire continent. China needed tall, powerful horses for its cavalry. The steppe produced them and would accept silk in exchange. Silk that conferred status, served as currency, and could be traded further west for other goods. This single barter arrangement, repeated thousands of times over hundreds of years, it drained Chinese imperial silk reserves and filled the steppes with a fabric that eventually reached through intermediate exchanges the markets of Persia, Byzantium, and Rome. The second most consequential commodity was almost certainly one that no one thinks of as a trade good at all, the silkworm itself. For roughly 1,000 years, China maintained its monopoly on silk production through a combination of law, geography, thus in the practical difficulty of keeping the Bombyx mori alive during transport. The Snorts monopoly broke in the 6th century CE when two Nestorian Christian monks arrived at the court of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I with silkworm eggs hidden inside their hollow bamboo walking canes. The eggs had been carried out of China at considerable personal risk. They hatched in Constantinople. Within a generation, the Byzantine Empire had its own silk industry. Shu and China's 1,000-year lock on the most valuable fabric in the ancient world was over. But the goods that moved along the Silk Road, however valuable, were secondary in their historical consequences to the things that moved invisibly. Every caravan that crossed Central Asia carried alongside its bales of silk and sacks of pepper the knowledge and beliefs of the people who loaded it. A Sogdian merchant returning from Chang'an brought back not just Chinese lacquerware, but familiarity with Chinese administrative practices, Buddhist devotional objects, and the names of Chinese gods. A Chinese pilgrim returning from India brought back not just Buddhist texts, but knowledge of Indian mathematics, astronomical observation methods, and medical practices. The goods were the visible surface of an exchange that ran far deeper, and two crops illustrate the depth of that invisible exchange better than any luxury good. The grapevine reached China along the Silk Road during the Han Dynasty. Chinese envoys sent west by the Emperor Wu encountered wine being made from grapes, a fact so surprising that they recorded it explicitly, named, noting that people in the western regions made wine from berries in the same way that Chinese made it from rice. Within a generation, grape cultivation had spread into the Tarim Basin and eventually into the heartland of China. Within a few centuries, wine had acquired enough cultural cash in Tang Dynasty China that it appeared in court poetry, in tomb paintings, and on the shelves of every prosperous household. A fruit that had been domesticated in the Caucasus region around 6000 BCE had crossed the continent and changed what people in China drank at dinner. Moving the other way, Yi began its journey from China toward the west at roughly the same period. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to trade for it in significant quantities in the 16th century. By 1657, it was being sold in London. By 1700, it had become a British national obsession, promoted vigorously by the East India Company, who needed a profitable return cargo for the ships they were sending to China, loaded with English-ish textiles. The company's commercial interest in tea-shaped British domestic culture so thoroughly that a beverage that had been drunk in China for 2,000 years became within 3 generations of its introduction to Britain the defining feature of English daily life. A plant that had grown wild in the forests of Yunnan province had, through the slow pressure of Silk Road commerce, become the thing the British believed they had always drunk. The full inventory of what the Silk Road moved across Eurasia runs to hundreds of items: crops, animals, fabrics, metals, pigments, musical instruments, playing cards, astronomical instruments, and political ideas. Each one carries a story of need, curiosity, and the unplanned accumulation of small decisions made by people who mostly had no idea their choices would persist. The word silk in the road's name is in that sense almost an accident of history, the visible tip of an exchange so vast and so various that no single commodity could represent it and no single road could contain it. The oldest religion on the Silk Road was almost certainly Zoroastrianism, founded by the Persian prophet Zoroaster, probably somewhere between the 11th and 6th centuries BCE in the highlands of eastern Iran or Central Asia. It was the dominant faith of the Persian Empire, and now through Persian commercial and military reach, the background religious landscape of much of the Central Asian world through which the trade routes ran. Zoroastrianism taught a universe divided between a god of light and a god of darkness, a cosmic struggle in which every human action carried moral weight. Its fire temples were among the most common permanent structures in the oasis cities of Central Asia. Their flames kept burning continuously as acts of devotion, and a Silk Road merchant, crossing from Persia into Bactria in the 3rd century CE, would have found fire altars in almost every significant settlement along the route. Buddhism arrived on the Silk Road from the south. It had been born in the Gangetic plain of northeastern India in the 5th century BCE, and by the time of the Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE. It was already spreading outward from India through missionary effort. Ashoka sent emissaries in every direction, south to Sri Lanka, west toward the Hellenistic kingdoms of the Near East, and north toward the mountain passes that led into Central Asia. The faith those emissaries carried was at its core a set of ideas about suffering, desire, and liberation that required no temple, no sacrifice, and no priestly caste to transmit. A monk with a begging bowl and a body of memorized texts was a fully portable religious institution, and the roads that carried merchants also carried monks. Use the vehicle that drove Buddhism deepest into Central Asia and eventually into China was the Kusan Empire. When the Kusan Emperor Kanishka converted to DDH I in the mid-2nd century CE and convened a major Buddhist council to codify doctrine in scripture, he turned the entire administrative and commercial weight of an empire straddling the Hindu Kush into a delivery mechanism for the faith. Kusan merchants traveling north into the Tim Basin carried Buddhist devotional objects alongside their trade goods. Kusan monks followed the same caravan routes, stopping at oasis towns to preach, and over time, those towns built monasteries to house them. The monasteries became waypoints on the road, places where a traveler could find shelter, food, and the company of educated men who could help him navigate the next stretch of the route. By the 2nd century CE, and Buddhist monks from Kusan and Parthian backgrounds were active in the Chinese capital of Liang, translating Buddhist scriptures into Chinese. The first translators were Central Asians, men like the Kusan monk, Loka, who arrived in Luoyang around 164 CEE and produced the first Chinese tea translations of Mahayana texts. The Buddhism these men brought to China was already a hybrid product. It had absorbed Hellenistic visual conventions in Gandhara, where sculptors trained in the Greek tradition had begun depicting the Buddha in human form for the first time, giving him flowing robes in a serene classical face and Persian administrative habits in Bactria. By the time it reached Chong'an, it had been reshaped by the cultures of a dozen different peoples. The Chinese reshaped it further to finding in Buddhist concepts of emptiness and impermanence a resonance with Taoist ideas about the nature of reality. The monk Xuan Zang, who walked from Chang'an to India between 629 and 645 CEE and returned with 657 texts loaded onto 20-pack horses, was not simply on a collecting expedition. He was motivated by a conviction that the Buddhist scriptures available in China had been poorly translated, that their meanings distorted by translators who had not fully understood the original Sanskrit. His journey was an act of scholarly dissatisfaction as much as religious devotion. When he returned, the Tang Emperor Taung, who had initially tried to stop him leaving, received him informal audience and offered him the resources of the imperial administration to support his translation work. The resulting translations, Yaz produced over the following 2 decades in a purpose-built translation bureau in Chan, became the canonical texts of East Asian Buddhism. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam all built their Buddhist traditions on the versions of the scriptures that Xuan Zang had walked 17 years across the continent to correct. While Buddhism was moving east, a different faith was moving in every direction simultaneously. Monarchism was founded by the Persian prophet Mani in 216 CE in the Parthian Empire. Naranet was from its beginning a faith designed for a world in motion. Mani explicitly framed his religion as the completion of all previous faiths. He claimed to be the successor of Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus simultaneously, and his scriptures incorporated elements from all three traditions. A monarchian missionary arriving in any part of the Silk Road world could present the local population with a version of their own existing beliefs reframed within a larger cosmic structure. And the faith spread with remarkable speed west into the Roman Empire, where it attracted the young Augustine of Hippo before he converted to Christianity, and east through Central Asia into China, where it arrived by the 7th century. The Sogdians were Manichism's most effective carriers eastward. When Sogdian merchants converted, they carried the faith into their trading diaspora, into the communities they maintained in cities from Samarkand to Chang'an, and presented it to their business partners along with their goods. Monarchism eventually became the official state religion of the Uyghur Khaganate, Snorts, the dominant power on the Central Asian steppe between 744 and 840 CE, holding that status for Glai 70 years. Its adoption by a steppe empire gave it the protection of military power and the reach of a network that stretched across the continent. When the Uyghur Khaganate collapsed, Manichism lost its patron and began a long, slow decline, surviving in pockets in Central Asia and coastal China until the 16th century, when the last documented Manichaean community disappeared from the historical record. Nestorian Christianity arrived on the Silk Road through a political accident in the Western Church. Notorious the Patriarch of Constantinople had argued in the 5th century CE that Jesus possessed two distinct natures, one divine, one human, a position declared heretical at the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE. His followers, expelled from the Byzantine world, moved east into Persia, and where the Sasanian Empire found some tactical satisfaction in offering sanctuary to Christians, the Byzantines had condemned. From Persia, Nestorian missionaries followed the trade routes eastward. A Syrian cleric, named Alepan, reached the Tong capital of Chang'an in 635 CE, was received by the Emperor Tang, and was given permission to build a monastery and translate Christian scriptures into Chinese. A stone monument erected in Chang'an in 781 CE, still standing, records the event in both Chinese and Syriac, calling the new faith the luminous religion and describing its doctrines with a vocabulary borrowed partly from Buddhism. The church that produced it was by then the easternmost Christian presence in the world. What happened to these faiths in the oasis cities of Central Asia was something the theology of none of them had entirely prepared for. They began to absorb each other. The interfan in the Tim Basin manuscripts have been found that contain Buddhist texts written in Sogdian script, Monasian hymns that borrow Buddhist cosmological imagery, and Nestorian Christian treatises that describe the saints using the same honorific vocabulary applied to Buddhas. A traitor arriving in Turfan in the 8th century CE and walking from one end of the city to the other would have passed a Zoroastrian fire temple, a Buddhist monastery, a Manichaean assembly hall, and a Nestorian church, all within the same walled settlement. The city was not philosophically confused. It was pragmatically cosmopolitan, and its residents were accustomed to the idea that the divine wore many faces. Islam arrived on the Silk Road through a different mechanism than the faiths before it. Snorts, its early expansion in the 7th century CE, was driven by military conquest. Arab armies sweeping north and east out of Arabia, absorbing Persia, taking Transaxana, and reaching the borders of Tang China. But military conquest created the conditions for commercial dominance. and it was through commerce that Islam penetrated most deeply into the populations it encountered. The Prophet Muhammad had been a merchant, and Islamic law gave trade a dignity that other cultural traditions often withheld from it. Muslim merchants who followed the Arab conquests into Central Asia found that their religious networks, the mosques, the madrasas, the shared legal frameworks that governed contracts and credit across the Islamic world functioned as a commercial infrastructure as effective as any road. The Sogdians, who had dominated Central Asian trade for centuries, made a pragmatic calculation. Many converted to Islam in the 8th century, not necessarily from conviction, but because the merchants who controlled the Fars, CTTTDTT, were Muslim and belonging to the same faith as your trading partners, reduced friction, built trust, and opened doors. The same pattern had played out earlier when Sogdian merchants converted to Buddhism to smooth their relationships with Buddhist trading partners in India and China. On the Silk Road, religion and commerce were inseparable systems, and conversion was, among other things, a business decision. By the 10th century, this Islam was the majority faith across most of the Central Asian world through which the Silk Road ran. Buddhism retreated eastward into China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia, where it had already taken a deep enough root to survive without Central Asian support. Manichaeism and Nestorian Christianity survived in pockets, but lost their commercial and political backing, and faded slowly from the mainstream. Zoroastrianism survived in Persia and among communities of refugees who carried it to India, and where their descendants, the Parsis, still maintain it today. The religious map of Asia that we recognize from the modern world was drawn in its essential outlines, not by conquest alone, but by the accumulated traffic of monks, merchants, and missionaries moving along roads that had been worn into the earth by the feet of people looking for something to trade. In 139 BCE, CEA, the Han Emperor Wu sent a courtier named Zhang Chen westward from Chan with a party of 100 men and a single diplomatic objective: find the Yusi people who had been dead, riven west by the Shang Niu, and persuade them to return east as military allies against China's most persistent enemy. Zhang Chen was captured by the Shang Niu within weeks of departure and held for 10 years. He married a Shang woman, had a son, and waited. When he finally escaped, he continued west, completed his mission, failed to secure the alliance, and made his way back to China. He arrived in Chang'an in 126 BCE, 13 years after he had left, accompanied by one surviving member of his original party and a quantity of geographical intelligence that would change the direction of Han foreign policy for the next century. What Zhang Qian brought back was the first detailed Chinese account of the Western world. He had seen Partha and Bactria. He had encountered the remnants of Alexander the Great's empire still functioning in Crete, the Fana Valley, where Greek-influenced Sikhs raised a horse unlike anything in China. Tall, point, powerful, with a deep chest and legs built for sustained speed. An animal that Chinese observers noted sweated what appeared to be blood during hard exertion. Zhang Qian described these Fogana horses to Emperor Wu as the horses of heaven. Wu, and whose cavalry was perpetually outmatched by Shang Niu riders on faster steppe ponies, immediately grasped what they represented. He would spend the next 2 decades trying to obtain them. The desire for Fogana horses drove the Han Empire deeper into Central Asia than it had ever gone. When diplomacy and tribute failed to produce animals of the quality Wu wanted, he launched a military campaign, 2 campaigns in 104 and 101 BCE, against the Kingdom of Taiwan in the Fana Valley and across the Premier Mountains, more than 5,000 kilometers from the Han heartland. The first expedition failed catastrophically, its supply lines too extended, its forces too depleted by the time they reached their objective. The second larger expedition succeeded. the Kingdom of Taiwan submitted. 3,000 Fana horses began the long journey east to Chong'an along a corridor that Han military garrisons were now permanently stationed to protect. The road those garrisons guarded would become the Northern Silk Road. The Han Empire's expansion into the Tim Basin and beyond was at its origin a military enterprise driven by the specific need for better horses. But the infrastructure it created, the garrisons, the relay stations, the extended Great Wall, the settled communities of soldier farmers posted along the Hexi corridor, produced as a secondary consequence the conditions under which long-distance trade could function, and merchants followed the soldiers. The posts that fed and supplied Han garrisons became the stopping points for caravans carrying silk, glass, and spices. The Silk Road's western extension into Central Asia was in its physical infrastructure largely a byproduct of an imperial horse-buying program. At the other end of the network, the Parthian Empire understood its position with considerably more clarity to Han the Han. The Parthians controlled the territory between China's sphere of influence and Rome's eastern frontier. The Iranian plateau, Mesopotamia, and the mountain passes connecting them to the west. Every caravan moving between east and west had to cross Parthian territory, and every caravan that crossed it paid taxes. The Parthians became wealthy not by producing anything the Silk Road carried, but by sitting between the people who did. Their capital Ctesiphon on the Tigris River south of modern Baghdad grew into one of the great cities of the ancient world on the proceeds of transit taxation alone. When the Roman Senate passed its feudal laws against silk, a portion of the price Romans paid for Chinese fabric was going through a chain of intermediaries into Parthian imperial revenues. The Kharsans, occupying the territory between Partha and Hanch China, built their empire on a version of the same logic, but with more productive foundations. Then they connected for the first time in history the overland routes of the Silk Road with the maritime trade of the Indian Ocean, routing goods through the Indus Valley to the ports of the Arabian Sea. A merchant dealing in Chinese silk could now move his goods by land to Kusan territory, transfer them to ships at Babarakum on the Indus Delta, and send them by sea to Roman ports in Egypt, bypassing the Parthian middlemen entirely. This routing advantage made the Kushans indispensable to both the trade they carried and the empires on either side of them, and their royal treasury at Bram, filled accordingly with Roman glassware, Chinese lacquer, Indian ivory, and Hellenistic bronzes arriving from every direction simultaneously. The empire that most deliberately and successfully organized itself around Silk Road control was the Tang dynasty of China, which ruled from 618 to 9007 CE and presided over the road's golden age. The Tang reconquered the western routes through Central Asia in 639 CE, established military garrisons at Hikiosi's cities, and made the protection of trade an explicit imperial policy. The capital Chang'an was at its peak in the 8th century, the most populous city on earth, with an estimated 2 million people in the city and its surrounding countryside. Among its permanent residents were 25,000 foreigners, Persian merchants, Sogdian traders, Japanese envoys, Korean scholars, Indian monks, and a community of Notorian Christians large enough to build a church that still has a stone monument commemorating its founding. Chong'an in the Tang period was a city that the Silk Road had made. Walking through Chong'an's western market in the 7th century meant moving through a compressed inventory of the entire known world. The stalls ran to Chinese silk and ceramics, Sogdian silverware, Persian textiles, Central Asian spices, 9 goods whose origins were so distant that the merchants selling them could not accurately name the places they had come from. The market had warehouses where traveling merchant TS could deposit goods, leave money on account, and stay for extended periods. 5 or 6 Zoroastrian and Manatian temples clustered around its edges, serving the foreign communities whose commerce sustained it. Tang court ladies had adopted the CF Tans, riding trousers and boots of Sogdian men as fashionable dress. The court musicians played Central Asian instruments. The emperor himself drank grape wine from Western Eurasia, a beverage that Chinese poets of the Tang period treated as an exotic luxury worth celebrating in verse. The Tang dynasty's prosperity rested on the roots it controlled, and when those roots became threatened, so did the dynasty. The Battle of Talis in 751 CEA saw Tang forces defeated by an Abbasid Arab army at the boundary of Central Asia, a halting Chinese westward expansion at the moment when Arab commercial and military power was extending east. The Andalusian Rebellion of 755 CE, an internal military revolt that the Tang barely survived, cost the dynasty its western territories and much of its administrative coherence. By the time the Tang recovered partial control, the Tibetan Empire had seized large sections of the corridor connecting Chang'an to Central Asia. Yes, and the commercial dominance that had made the 8th century extraordinary was gone. The road did not disappear, but its management passed to other hands. Those other hands in the western half of the network belonged to the Abbasid Caliphate founded in 750 CEA and, headquartered in Baghdad, a city the second Abbasid Caliph Al-Mensa had constructed from nothing on the Tigris River, specifically because the site sat at the intersection of the most profitable overland and river trade routes in the known world. Baghdad was built in 4 years between 762 and 766 CE, using over 100,000 workers. Its circular design, ringed by 2 concentric fortified walls, placed the Caliph's palace at the core. A city that was already within decades of its founding among the most populated on earth. By the reign of Harun al-Rashid in the late 8th century, Baghdad's population had reached roughly 1 million people. Its markets flooded with Chinese silk, paper, and ceramics. Its libraries filling with translated texts from Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese sources. The Abbasid relationship with the Silk Road was different from any earlier empire's management of it. The Caliphate provided security, legal infrastructure, sit in a shared commercial framework across a territory stretching from Central Asia to the Atlantic coast of North Africa. Muslim merchants trading within that territory shared a common legal system governing contracts, a common credit instrument, the zuwaja, a forerunner of the Bill of Exchange, and a network of mosques and madrasas that functioned as the commercial infrastructure of every city they reached. The Abbasids did not simply tax the road. They provided the institutional conditions under which it could operate at a scale and sophistication that the Parthe and An-Tang had never managed. Under Abbasid commercial law, a merchant in Samarkand could extend credit to a partner in Cairo and enforce that contract in either city. Long-distance trade for the first time had something approaching a legal system, and every empire that built itself on the Silk Road eventually discovered the same vulnerability. Its prosperity was inseparable from the routes that fed it, and those routes ran through terrain that no single empire could permanently control. The Han lost their western garrisons to the costs of overextension. The Parthians fell to the Sasanians, who inherited both their territory and their transit revenues. The Kusans fragmented under pressure from Sasani and Persia in the west and the Gupta Empire in the east. The Tang lost their western corridor to rebellion and Tibetan expansion. The Abbasids watched their commercial dominance erode as regional powers fractured their empire from within, and a new force gathered on the steppe to north and east. A force whose arrival would simultaneously destroy more of the Silk Road than any event in its history, and create the conditions for its final flowering. In the spring of 1220, the people of Bukhara watched Genghis Khan ride into the grand mosque of their city, dismount, and ask whether this was the palace of the Sultan. When told it was the house of God, he climbed to the pulpit and announced that the sins of the city's people had brought this reckoning upon them. Then his soldiers stripped the mosque's furnishings, fed the sacred Quran pages to their horses as bedding, and used the building's marble floors as a stable. The event was recorded by eyewitnesses. It was intended to be recorded. The terror it produced was a military instrument as deliberate as any siege engine. Naskangas Khan's approach to resistance was consistent and clearly communicated. A city that surrendered without fighting was spared. A city that fought was destroyed. The cities of MV, Nishapur, A. Nd Hat resisted, and their populations were put to the sword. The numbers in contemporary chronicles run to hundreds of thousands killed in each case. These figures are almost certainly exaggerated, as medieval chroniclers reliably overstated atrocities. But the destruction was real, thorough, and purposeful. MV was still in ruins when a traveler passed through it a century later. Nishapur was never rebuilt on its original site. The Mongols did not kill for pleasure. They killed to make an example that the next city would remember when the horsemen appeared at its gates. Samarkand, the great Central Asian entrepot that had been cosmopolitan since the time of Alexander the Great, surrendered. Its population was spared but looted, and 60,000 skilled craftsmen, weavers, metalworkers, architects were conscripted and sent east to serve the Mongol court. The city was left standing but emptied of the very people who had made it function. Genghis Khan was not simply a destroyer of civilization. NS. He was a systematic extractor of their human capital, relocating the skills and knowledge of conquered cities into the infrastructure of his own expanding empire. The campaign that brought the Mongols into Central Asia at all had begun with a commercial dispute in 1218, where Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of several hundred merchants westward to the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled Persia and Central Asia. The governor of Uttara, a border city in what is now Kazakhstan, had the merchants executed as spies and confiscated their goods. Genghis Khan sent a diplomatic mission demanding the governor's extradition. The Khwarezmian Shah killed the envoys. What followed was the conquest of one of the largest empires of the Islamic world in roughly 3 years. The scale and speed of the destruction that resulted from the execution of those merchants in Otta is among the most extreme demonstrations in history of what happens when a great P's commercial interests are attacked without the capacity to defend against the response. By 1227, when Genghis Khan died during a campaign in northwestern China, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific coast to the Caspian Sea. His successors continued the expansion. In 1258, N's grandson Hulagu Khan besieged Baghdad. The Abbasid Caliph, who had ruled as the symbolic head of the Sunni Muslim world for 5 centuries, refused to surrender. The city fell in February of that year. The Caliph was executed by being rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses. The Mongols refused to shed royal blood directly. Baghdad's population, which had stood at perhaps 300,000 to 400,000, was massacred over the following week. The books of the city's 36 public libraries were thrown into the Tigris River in such quantities that, according to contemporary accounts, the water ran black with ink for days. 750 years of accumulated Islamic scholarship, translations of Greek philosophy, original work in mathematics and astronomy, medical treatises, geographical survey, RVAs sank into the river mud. The sack of Baghdad in 1258 ended the Islamic Golden Age as a centralized intellectual enterprise. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had been the most important single institutional patron of learning in the medieval world, ceased to exist. The scholars who survived dispersed to Cairo, to Anatolia, to Persia's provincial courts. They carried their knowledge with them, and much of it survived. But the concentrated institutional energy of Baghdad, as a city where 8 centuries of translation, commentary, and original inquiry had accumulated, was gone. The loss echoed through the intellectual history of the following century in the same way that the loss of a great library echoes not in a single catastrophic gap, but in the absence of things that would otherwise have existed. And yet, within a generation of that destruction, the Mongol Empire had created the conditions for the most open and connected trading world in human history. The Mongol postal system, the Yam, extended across the entire empire by the end of the 13th century, with approximately 10,000 relay stations spaced 20 to 40 kilometers apart, each stocked with fresh horses, food, and accommodation for official travelers. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than months. The roads that caravans used were patrolled by Mongol garrisons whose authority extended across borders that had previously been defended by competing empires, each taxing the trade that passed through them. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, a merchant could travel from the Black Sea to the Chinese coast without crossing a single hostile border. The practical consequences were immediate and substantial. European merchants, who had never been able to access the eastern trade routes directly because the Silk Road passed through territories controlled by the Abbasids and their successors, who had little incentive to accommodate Christian traders, could now travel under Mongol protection all the way to China. The Genoese established a trading post at Kaffa on the Crimean coast under a treaty with the Golden Horde, the Mongol successor state controlling the western steppe. From Kaffa, caravans ran east across the steppe through Mongol-controlled Central Asia to China for the first time in history. And a European merchant could make the entire journey in a single continuous movement through a territory governed by a single legal authority imperfectly, brutally, but continuously. The most famous person to make that journey was a Venetian merchant's son named Marco Polo, who left Venice in 1271 and reached the court of Kublai Khan Genghis Khan's grandson, who ruled China as the Yuan dynasty in 1275. He remained in China for 17 years and working in various capacities for the Mongol administration, and returned to Venice in 1295. His account of what he had seen dictated to a fellow prisoner in a Genoese jail after his capture in a naval battle became one of the most widely read books in Europe, a catalogue of Chinese wealth, sophistication, and scale that most Europeans found incredible but could not entirely dismiss. Whether Polo reached China at all, or merely assembled his account from other travelers' stories, remains genuinely uncertain. What is beyond doubt is that the route he described existed, had been traveled, and was passable precisely because the Mongols had made it so. Kublai Khan's management of the Silk Road went well beyond maintaining security. He extended the Grand Canal of China northward to his capital at Dadu, modern Beijing, connecting the agricultural surplus of southern China to the commercial machinery of the north. He issued paper currency, backed by the authority of the Mongol state, to facilitate large transactions along the trade routes. He constructed orthog partnerships, state-backed commercial enterprises that provided capital to private merchants and shared in their profits. European banking innovations that appeared in the following century. Bills of exchange, deposit banking, letters of credit were developments of instruments that had been in common use in the Mongol commercial system for decades. The financial infrastructure of the modern world has a partial ancestry in the yurts of the Mongolian steppe. The Mongol rulers were, by the standards of any medieval polity, remarkably tolerant of religious difference. Genghis Khan's own shamanist tradition offered no particular claim to universal truth, and the Mongol administrative system had no institutional interest in imposing religious conformity on the populations it governed. Taurian Christian churches, Buddhist monasteries, Islamic mosques, and Taoist temples operated simultaneously in Mongol cities across the empire. Kublai Khan celebrated Christmas, Easter, Passover, and the Islamic festival of Eid at his court, not from personal conviction, but from a political calculation that a diverse empire required a diverse religious policy. The result was a century in West, which the Silk Road's oasis cities became more cosmopolitan than they had ever been. They're patronized by an imperial power that had no interest in what its subjects believed, only in what they produced and traded. The Mongol Empire began to fragment after Kublai Khan's death in 1294. The four successor Khonides that divided the empire pursued their own interests, converted to Islam and other faiths, and lost the administrative coherence that had made the Pax Mongolica function. By the mid-4th century, the roads were becoming dangerous again, the relay stations unreliable, and the borders contested. The Ming dynasty, which overthrew the Mongol Yuan in China in 1368, turned inward, suspicious of the outside world that had sent the conquering hordes. The window that the Mongols had opened, the single century in which the full length of Eurasia had been traversable by anyone with the will and the resources to attempt, it was closing, and traveling through it undetected by anyone who sent it. As something that would kill more Europeans than the Mongols ever had. In a trading settlement in the Chui Valley of what is now northern Kyrgyzstan, people began dying in unusual numbers in 1338. Their tombstones carved in Syriac recorded the cause of death as pestilence. At least 118 people from the same community were buried in 2 years. A mortality spike so pronounced that the cemetery itself documents the event in stone. The settlement sat at a well-traveled junction on the Silk Road's northern route and surrounded by the foothills of the Tian Shan Mountains, where marmots lived in dense colonies in the high pastures above the valley floor. The pestilence had come from those animals. It would reach London within a decade. The bacterium was Yersinia pestis, and it had almost certainly been circulating in the rodent populations of the Tian region for some time before it crossed into the human community at Chu. Marmots were trapped and eaten throughout Central Asia, where a marmot curry, Ng-infected fleas, was an ordinary hazard of the hunting and trapping life. Under normal conditions, the bacterium killed its human host quickly enough that the infection did not spread far from the original contact. What changed in the late 1330s was almost certainly the density and movement of the human population. The Pax Mongolica had filled the trade routes with merchants, soldiers, and travelers to a degree unprecedented in Central Asian history. In a pathogen that required human movement to travel, had never had so efficient a vehicle. From the Chui Valley, the plague moved westward along the same routes the caravans used, following water sources and stopping points through Central Asia toward the Black Sea. The journey covered roughly 3,500 kilometers and took about 8 years, arriving on the Crimean coast by 1345 or 1346. Its progress was not continuous or even. It moved in pulses, igniting in a settlement, to burning through its population, then traveling to the next stopping point, on an infected person's body or in the fleas living on the rats that inevitably accompanied any caravan's grain supply. The Silk Road's greatest logistical achievement from the plague's perspective was the caravanserai system, a chain of stopping points spaced precisely far enough apart to allow an infected traveler to arrive, incubate, and begin spreading the disease before moving on. The Genoese trading post at Kaffa on the Crimean coast was by the 1340s one of the most important commercial entrepôts in the Western Silk Road system, the point where overland trade from Central Asia met the maritime routes of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. In 1345, a Mongol army under the Khan Janabeg laid siege to it, and the plague arrived among his forces before the city fell. Janabeg's army was decimated. Before withdrawing, his forces used their siege engines to catapult the corpses of plague victims over Kaffa's walls, the first documented instance of biological warfare in history. Whether this act was decisive in infecting the city is debated. The rats that moved freely between the Mongol siege lines and the city walls probably did more damage than any trebuch. Either way, by 1347, Kaffa was infected. The Genoese merchants who fled Kaffa by sea carried the plague with them, in their bodies and in the rats that lived in the holds of their ships. Their galleys docked at Constantinople in the summer of 1347. The city, already weakened by decades of internal conflict, lost a proportion of its population within months. The Byzantine Emperor John V Kakusinos watched his own 13-year-old son die of the disease and wrote a description of its symptoms modeled on Thucydides' account of the plague of Athens. It the most authoritative text on epidemic illness that the medieval world possessed. The emperor was reaching for the best framework available and finding it inadequate. Nothing in the medical tradition of the Byzantine world had prepared anyone for what was happening from Constantinople. Genoese ships carried the plague westward into the Mediterranean. It reached Sicily in October 1347, Genoa and Venice in January 1348, and Pisa a few weeks later. And from those northern Italian ports, it moved inland. Avignon, then the seat of the papacy, was infected by January 1348. Paris fell by late summer. England was reached in September. By 1349, the plague was in Scotland, Ireland, and Scandinavia. By 1350, it had reached Greenland. The speed was extraordinary. The disease moved at roughly the pace of medieval commercial traffic, tracing the exact routes that connected European markets to each other, killing as it went. A disease that had originated in the Tianan Mountains had in under 3 years circumnavigated the western portion of the Eurasian trade network and reached the edge of the known world. The snorts symptoms left no room for ambiguity about what was happening. Victims developed swollen lymph nodes in the groin, armpits, and neck. The buboes that gave the dead disease one of its names, which grew to the size of an apple or an egg and filled with pus. Fever, delirium, and intense pain followed. In its bubonic form, roughly half of those infected died within a week. In its pneumonic form, when the infection reached the lungs and became transmissible through the air, the mortality rate was effectively 100%. In its septase form, internal hemorrhaging produced black patches beneath the skin. Physicians encountering it for the first time had no context for what they were seeing. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence in 1348, described corpses lying in the streets with no one to carry them, neighbors refusing to enter each other's houses, and parents abandoning children who showed the first symptoms. Florence lost between 50 and 80% of its population within 4 months in 1348. Paris buried 800 dead a day at the epidemic's peak. Hamburg and Bremen lost at least 60% of their populations. London's mortality was probably similar. The total European death to LL between 1347 and 1353 was somewhere between 25 and 50 million people. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire continent's population. The numbers are almost impossible to hold in the mind, and the medieval sources rarely tried to hold them accurately. What they recorded instead was the texture of catastrophe. The carts moving through city streets before dawn to collect the previous night's dead, the mass graves dug outside city walls, and the sudden silence of neighborhoods where every household had lost members, the priests who refused to administer last rites because they had watched too many other priests die of it. The plague movement exposed with brutal clarity the geography of medieval European commerce. The regions that died fastest and most completely were the ones most deeply connected to the trade routes, the Italian cities, the Hanseatic ports, the markets along the main roads. The regions that survived relatively intact were the isolated ones, the highlands of Baron and Sioux, Auvergne, France, parts of Poland, rural areas far from navigable rivers and established roads. The Black Death was, among other things, a map of medieval Europe's commercial integration drawn in deaths. The immediate responses were desperate and largely useless. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, dietary modifications, and the avoidance of strong southerly winds, yet working from humoral theories of disease that predated the birth of Christ by 5 centuries. Some cities began burning the clothing and possessions of the dead. Others restricted the movement of people from infected areas. The earliest quarantine measures in European history intuited from observation rather than derived from any understanding of how the disease actually spread. Venice imposed a 30-day isolation period on arriving ships in 1348, and extending it to 40 days, a quarantino, and giving the modern concept its name. The practice worked imperfectly and was remembered when plague returned, as it did repeatedly. Why, for the next 3 centuries, European cities applied it again and refined it further. The Black Death was, among other things, the school in which Europe learned to think about infectious disease. The survivors of the plague rebuilt a different Europe. A farm laborer in England in 1349, if he lived, he found himself in a labor market where every surviving worker was suddenly scarce. Wages in England rose between 12 and 28% in the decade after the first outbreak, and in some localities, the immediate increases were far more dramatic. A ploughman who had earned 2 shillings a week before the plague was demanding 10 shillings in 1350, and lords who had relied on the fixed obligations of serf labor for generations had to compete for workers with money and better terms of tenure. The memorial system, already strained before the plague, could not survive the arithmetic of mass death. Serfdom began its end in Western Europe not through any philosophical argument about human dignity, but through the simple, relentless pressure of supply and demand in a world where half the supply had died. The century that followed the Black Death produced in rapid succession the printing press, the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, and the voyages of discovery. Historians have argued with considerable evidence that the plague was a precondition for all of them, that the collapse of the medieval social order, the sudden mobility of surviving workers, the crisis of confidence in the Church, whose prayers had saved no one, that in the desperate hunger for labor-saving devices in a world suddenly short of labor created the conditions in which those transformations became possible. The road that carried silk and horses and paper across Eurasia had, in its last great act of transmission, sent something that killed 1/3 of Europe and freed the other 2/3 to build the modern world. Paper began as a Chinese imperial tool. The court Unisune is traditionally credited with refining its product on around 105 CE, though Chinese craftsmen were making a cruder version of the material 2 or 3 centuries earlier from hemp, fishing nets, and mulberry bark. By the 2nd century CE, the Chinese were using paper for letters, administrative records, religious texts, and toilet hygiene. The material was so woven into daily Chinese life by the Tang dynasty that travelers noted it with something approaching bewilderment. The Arab merchant Sulian al-Tajir, writing about China in the 9th century, observed with evident case that the Chinese did not wash themselves after relieving themselves, but wiped with paper, a practice he considered indelicate. He had described, without realizing it, the most advanced sanitary standard in the medieval world. Yet, the route paper took westward out of China followed the same logic as every other exchange on the Silk Road. It moved through the hands of people who recognized its usefulness before it moved through any deliberate program of dissemination. Buddhist monks, who were among the most mobile populations in Central Asia during the early centuries CE, carried paper and the knowledge of making it from China into India and along the oasis routes of Central Asia. The monasteries that lined the Silk Road stopping points became, among other things, scriptoria, places where texts were copied onto paper and distributed further. A Chinese invention found its first broad application outside China in the service of an Indian religion, spreading eastward and westward simultaneously. By the time Arab armies reached Central Asia in the 8th century, papermaking was already established at Samarkand. The city had been producing paper for export for some time. A Persian geographical text written in the 10th century noted that Samarkand's paper was so highly regarded that ministers in Egypt preferred to order their supply from there rather than from closer sources, the paper traveling several thousand kilometers to reach them. When the Abbasid Caliphate's Grand Vizier Al-Felia ordered paper mills established in Baghdad in 794 CE. He was not introducing a new technology so much as scaling up one he had already encountered through Silk Road trade. Within a generation, Baghdad had an entire district devoted to paper merchants. Suk al-Workin, the street of booksellers, lined with more than 100 shops selling paper and the books written on it. What paper did for Baghdad was what it would later do for every city it reached. It lowered the cost of transmitting knowledge so dramatically that the volume of knowledge in circulation expanded far beyond anything the previous writing surface could support. Papyrus was an Egyptian monopoly, expensive, fragile in cold climates, and requiring import from a single source. Parchment required the skins of 200 animals to produce a single Bible. Paper could be made anywhere that plant fiber existed from rags, hemp, flax, or linen using water-powered mills that had no equivalent cost in animal lives. When the cost of the writing surface fell, the number of things worth writing down expanded to fill the available supply. The Baghdad the paper built was extraordinary by any measure of the medieval world. The Caliph Harun al-Rashid established a translation bureau Bait al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, where Greek, Persian, Indian texts were translated into Arabic by teams of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars working side by side. The mathematician al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the 9th century, synthesized Greek geometric methods with Indian numerological systems and produced the foundational texts of algebra, a word derived from the title of his book, Al-Abtariyaba. The physician Ibn Sina, whose canon of medicine was completed in 1025, drew on Greek, in Persian and Indian medical kolba traditions to produce a comprehensive medical text that was still being used as a university textbook in Europe 6 centuries later. None of this work could have been produced, stored, or transmitted at the scale it was without cheap paper. The Islamic Golden Age was in its material foundations a paper age. Paper reached Europe through two routes simultaneously. Italian merchants trading in Cairo and Damascus encountered it in the markets there and began bringing it back in the 11th and 12th centuries. At roughly the same time, the sophisticated Islamic culture of Al-Andalus, Muslim Spain, was producing paper at mills in Zativa as early as 1056. And the scholars of Toledo and Cordoba, who translated Arabic scientific texts into Latin, were doing so on paper that had begun its life as Chinese technology. The oldest known paper document in Europe is the Missal of Silos from 11th century Spain, written on paper almost certainly manufactured in the Islamic south of the peninsula. Paper entered the European intellectual tradition through the back door of a conquered Iberian city. European reception of paper was initially suspicious. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, aware of the material but uncertain of its durability, ordered that documents previously written on paper be recopied onto parchment. The abbot Peter the Venerable of Cluny wrote that paper was made from vile materials and questioned whether anything important ought to be entrusted to it. His objection was theological as much as practical. Parchment was made from the skins of clean animals, paper from rags and refuse, and the distinction seemed to matter. These reservations dissolved within a generation predictably as soon as the economics became clear. A book that cost 200 animal skins on parchment cost a fraction of that on paper, and the emerging European merchant class had no interest in paying more for their account books than they had to. By the 13th century, paper mills were operating in Fabriano, and Amalfi in Italy. And Italian papermakers had introduced a watermark, a distinctive design pressed into the paper during manufacture that identified the mill and guaranteed the quality of the product. By the mid-4th century, mills were producing paper in France and Germany. The volume of paper available in Europe in 1400 was several orders of magnitude greater than plaid it had been a century earlier, and the effect was already visible in the texture of daily life. He, the Italian poet Petrarch, composed his verses by writing drafts on paper, crossing out words, and revising a process impossible on expensive parchment, where every mark was permanent. Artists in Florence were sketching preliminary drawings in a way that the cost of parchment had made economically indefensible a generation before. The availability of a cheap writing surface was reshaping what it meant to think on paper. Into this world of abundant paper came Johannes Gutenberg, where a goldsmith in the German city of Mainz, who understood from his craft the precise tolerances required to cast identical metal objects from a mold. Around 1440, he adapted a screw press used for wine and oil production, combined it with movable metal-type cast, a punch and matrix system he developed himself, and produced a printing process capable of reproducing identical pages at a speed no scriptorum could match. His first major project was a Bible, 180 copies, as of which 49 survive. The Catholic Church, his most reliable customer, bought printed indulgences from him by the thousands. Within 20 years of his first press operating in Mainz, printing presses were established in more than 200 European cities. Gutenberg died in debt, his press impounded by a creditor. The world he had made took no particular notice. The press found its economic footing in Venice, which was in the 1460s and 1470s, the central shipping hub of the Mediterranean. A printer who produced 200 copies of a book in Mainz had no obvious way to sell them. A printer, operating in Venice, could sell several copies to the captain of every ship leaving port, and those ships called at every port in the Mediterranean world. Venice became within a decade of its first press operation, the printing capital of Europe. Net, in the books it produced, flowed outward along the same maritime trade routes that had brought paper from the East to begin with. The commercial infrastructure of the Silk Road successor network was now carrying printed books to every literate city in the known world. On the last day of October 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther nailed a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. His 95 thesis challenged the Catholic Church's practice of selling indulgences, payments made to reduce time in purgatory, and called for public debate on the theology behind them. The Church had seen reformers before, John Wycliffe in the 14th century, Jan Hus in the 15th. Both had made the same essential arguments. Both had been silenced. Their manuscripts easily suppressed. Luther's document was on a printing press in London within 17 days of his posting it. Within 2 months, it had been reproduced across Germany. Within a year, it was circulating throughout Europe in editions the Church had no mechanism to contain. Every time the Church published a list of banned books, the printers knew exactly what to print next. The Reformation was the first historical event driven by mass media, and the mass medium it ran on was a Chinese invention that had spent 700 years traveling west, where the chain that connected the paper mulberry trees of Han Dynasty China to the printing presses of Reformation Europe runs through Buddhist monks, Sogdian merchants, Abbasid bureaucrats, Italian papermakers, and a goldsmith in Mainz who had probably never heard of any of them. No one in that chain had set out to democratize knowledge, challenge the Church, or enable the scientific revolution. The mulberry bark was just material. The rags were just waste. The press was just a winescrew turned to a different purpose. The Silk Road's deepest lesson is inscribed. Ed in that chain. The most consequential things in history rarely announce their significance at the moment they happen. By the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire occupied a single city, Constantinople, which had once commanded the trade of the eastern Mediterranean and served as the western Trajan terminus of the overland Silk Road for over 1,000 years, and now controlled only its own walls. The surrounding countryside had been absorbed by the Ottoman Turks over the preceding century, leaving the city as an island of Christian imperial authority in a sea of Ottoman territory. Its population had fallen to somewhere between 50 and 100,000, a fraction of what it had been at the empire's height. The Emperor Constantine XI Palaeolus ruled a ruin of an empire, and by the spring of 1453, he knew it. The Sultan Mehmed II was 21 years old when he laid siege to Constantinople in April 1453. He brought with him an army of between 60 and 80,000 men and a weapon that Constantinople's legendary walls had never faced. A bronze cannon nearly 10 meters long with a barrel capable of hurling a stone ball of 450 kilograms, more than a kilometer and a half. The cannon had been cast by a Hungarian engineer named Orbin Nick, who had first offered his services to the Byzantine emperor and been turned away. The imperial treasury could not afford him. Mehmed could. The cannon that breached Constantinople's walls had been funded partly by the revenues of a trade network the Byzantines had once controlled. The city fell on the 29th of May, 1453. Constantine XI died on the walls, his body never positively identified among the dead. Hagia Sophia and the great cathedral of Eastern Christendom, built by Justinian 900 years earlier, was converted to a mosque within days. The Ottoman Sultan rode through the city on a white horse and wept, according to one account, that the sight of so much grandeur reduced to ruin. He then set about rebuilding it. Mehmed moved quickly to repopulate county. Constantinople, renamed Istanbul from the Turkish rendering of a Greek phrase meaning into the city, resettling Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Nasran Muslims from across the empire, commissioning the Grand Bazaar, and re-establishing the commercial networks that had made the city worth taking. The news of Constantinople's fall reached Rome in July 1453 and produced, across Catholic Europe, something between grief and panic. The city had been the oldest continuously Christian capital in the world, the seat of a church that stretched back to the Apostolic Age. Its loss to a Muslim empire was for many Europeans, but not merely a political event, but an apocalyptic one, the sign that the world was turning against Christendom in ways that military power and prayer had both failed to prevent. Pope Nicholas V called immediately for a new crusade. Almost no one responded. Europe's attention was turning in a different direction. The practical consequences for European commerce were immediate and sharpening. The Ottomans had controlled the land routes between Europe and Asia since their expansion into Anatolia decades before Constantinople fell, and they had been taxing the trade that passed through their territory. Accordingly, Ottoman control did not completely block the overland routes. Historians who describe the Silk Road as simply closed after 1453 are overstating it, but it raised costs, increased unpredictability, and most importantly concentrated the wealth of Eurasian commerce into Ottoman hands and their Venetian trading partners at precisely the moment when other European powers had developed the ambition and the maritime technology to look for alternatives. Venice had negotiated trade agreements with the Ottomans and retained access to Eastern goods, but the terms were unfavorable and grew more so. Genoa, whose Black Sea trading post at Catha had been a major conduit for Eastern goods, he lost access to those routes within 2 decades of Constantinople's fall. The Italian cities that had grown wealthy on Silk Road trade were being squeezed between Ottoman tariffs and the rising maritime ambitions of Portugal and Spain. Atlantic-facing kingdoms that had no access to the traditional Mediterranean routes and therefore had every incentive to find new ones. The commercial geography of Europe was shifting westward toward the Atlantic seaboard, and in the power that came with it was shifting with it. Portugal had been moving in this direction for decades before Constantinople fell. Under the patronage of Prince Henry, known to history as Henry the Navigator, though he personally went to sea rarely, Portuguese mariners had been systematically extending their knowledge of the African coastline since the 1420s, pushing further south with each successive voyage, developing the navigational techniques, ship designs, and cartographic knowledge that would eventually make oceanic travel viable. The caravel, the Portuguese ship that made these voyages possible, was a direct development of knowledge accumulated through long exposure to Arab maritime technology in the Moroccan ports that Portugal had been trading with and fighting over for a century. The vessel that would eventually reach India carried in its design traces of an older east-west exchange. In 1488, Nartodas rounded the Cape of Good Hope at Africa's southern tip, demonstrating for the first time that the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected, that a ship sailing south from Europe could turn east and reach Asia without crossing Ottoman or Venetian territory. The King of Portugal received the news with careful attention and moved slowly. 9 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships and 148 men and sailed south and east around the Cape. He reached Calicut on the southwest coast of India on the 20th of May. 1498. Of the 148 men who left Lisbon, 55 returned. The crossing of the Indian Ocean had taken 23 days in one direction and 132 in the other, with half the circumference. Ryu dying of scurvy on the return. Dama brought back spices, and the Portuguese crown judged the exchange acceptable and immediately began planning a larger expedition. The trade network Dama entered at Calicut had been functioning efficiently for centuries under Arab, Indian, and Swahili management. Arab merchants who had maintained the Indian Ocean spice trade for generations watched the Portuguese arrive with suspicion that proved entirely justified. Dama's gifts, cloth, coral beads, yet the kind of goods that worked in West African coastal trade were considered insulting by the Zamorin of Calicut's court, where Arab merchants arrived with gold, silver, and fine textiles. The Portuguese had found the Indian Ocean trade, but they had arrived at the table with nothing adequate to sit down with. Their solution on subsequent voyages was artillery. They came back with warships and bombarded ports that refused to trade on Portuguese terms. The age of European maritime empire began not with superior products or ideas, but with superior guns. While Dama was sailing east, a Genoese mariner and Spanish employee was sailing west. Christopher Columbus had read Marco Polo's account of China's wealth and Ptolemy's ancient geographical text, which substantially underestimated the Conde. That Asia lay roughly 5,000 kilometers west of the Canary Islands. In this he was wrong by the full width of 2 continents. When he landed in the Bahamas in October 1492, Poca ha that belief through 4 voyages to the region, and continued to hold that belief through 4 voyages to the region. The continent whose existence he refused to acknowledge bore at his death the name of Ago Vespucci, an Italian merchant who recognized more clearly than Columbus did that the land mass across the Atlantic was not Asia, but something Europe had no name for. The Byzantine scholars who fled Constantinople in 1453 contributed to all of this in ways they could not have anticipated. Carrion, G manuscripts, and the knowledge of Greek in their baggage, they settled in Florence, Venice, and Rome, where they taught Greek to a generation of Italian humanists and introduced the complete works of Plato, essentially unknown in the medieval Latin West, into the intellectual life of the Renaissance. the ancient geographical texts they brought with them, including Ptolemy's geography, gave European graphers their first sophisticated mathematical framework for representing the Earth's surface. The maps that Columbus and Darma navigated by were drawn partly from geographical knowledge that had survived in Constantinople's libraries and been carried west in the luggage of refugees. The fall of a city had scattered its learning into the world. In the decades after Darma's first voyage, the overland Silk Road did not simply vanish, and caravans continued to move across Central Asia and through Ottoman territory. The routes that Bronze Age pastoralists had worn into the earth by following their herds through mountain passes were not going to disappear because a Portuguese sailor had found a way around Africa. But the balance of commercial power had shifted permanently. The maritime routes were faster, carried larger cargoes. Nand for European traders bypassed the Ottoman tariffs that had been compressing their margins for decades. Samarkand, MV, and Bukhara, which had been among the most prosperous and cosmopolitan cities on earth during the Silk Road's golden age, began their long retreat into provincial obscurity. The world had been rewired, and the new wires ran through Lisbon and Seville, not through the mountain passes of the Premier. In 2013, the Chinese President Xi Jinping announced, and during a visit to Kazakhstan, a plan to build a network of railways, highways, pipelines, and ports connecting China to Central Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. He called it the Belt and Road Initiative. Its engineers and financiers would eventually reach 150 countries, commit over $1 trillion in investment, and touch the lives of roughly 5 billion people. Xi chose his symbolic framing deliberately. He called it the New Silk Road. The name was not nostalgia, and it was a claim about how the world works, that the routes matter, that whoever builds and controls them shapes what moves through them, and that the relationship between China and the rest of the world has always been defined by the same logic that drove a Han emperor to send a diplomat west in 139 BCE to find better horses. The original Silk Road left no ruins. There is no wall to visit, no forum to walk through, no aqueduct carrying water that someone built 2,000 years ago. The physical evidence is scattered. A watchtower in the Gansu corridor, a caravanserai in Uzbekistan, half consumed by desert sand, a stone inscription in Changon, commemorating a Netorian church that no longer exists. What the Silk Road built was not stone. It was the interior architecture of the world, the distribution of crops, and religions and diseases and ideas across the human population of Eurasia, reshaping what people ate, what they believed, what they died of, and what they knew. The absence of ruins is appropriate. The Silk Road was always more process than place. The breakfast table of an ordinary person in the modern world is a Silk Road artifact. The tea in the cup originated in the forests of Yunnan and spread westward through the same commercial networks that carried silk. The pepper on the eggs was the single most traded commodity in medieval Eurasian commerce, fought over by Venetians and Arabs and Portuguese for 1,000 years. Then the wheat and the bread was domesticated in the Fertile Crescent and spread east to China through the Bronze Age exchange routes that preceded the Silk Road by 2 millennia. The sugar in everything was refined from a plant domesticated in New Guinea, which reached India, then Persia, then the medieval Islamic world, then Europe through the same chain of hand exchanges that moved every other commodity across the continent, where the ordinary morning meal of the modern world is a record of 10,000 years of human movement. The philosophical and scientific foundations of the modern world carry the same ancestry. The numerals used to write every calculation, balance every account, and encode every piece of digital information are called Arabic, but they originated in India and were transmitted to Europe through the paper makers and translators of the Abbasid Caliphate. The algebra that underlies every engineering calculation was written in 9th century Baghdad by a scholar working in a tradition assembled from Greek, Persian, and Indian sources that had converged in the Islamic world through the commercial and intellectual traffic of the Silk Road. The paper those calculations were written on had started its journey in Han Dynasty, China. The printing press that eventually distributed them across Europe was built by a German goldsmith working with the technology whose Chinese antecedents were already 500 years old. The religions that more than half the world's population practice today found their current geographical distribution through the same network. Buddhism moved from India into China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia along the trade routes. Islam spread from Arabia into Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and sub-Saharan Africa through merchant networks as much as through conquest. Christianity reached China in the 7th century in the baggage of Notorian missionaries, following the same caravan routes that carried silk and Forgana horses. The religious map of the modern world was drawn not by any single act of divine intervention or imperial decree, but by the accumulated movement of monks, merchants, pilgrims through the mountain passes and desert corridors of Central Asia over 1,500 years. The diseases that shaped human immunity, that drove the development of quarantine and epidemiology and the germ theory of disease that killed more people in some centuries than all wars combined. These two were Silk Road travelers. The plague bacterium that killed a third of Europe in the 14th century had been circulating in the rodent populations of the Central Asian steppe for generations before a marmot hunter in the Tianan Mountains brought it into human contact. The journey from that hunter's hands to the streets of Florence, Paris, and London traced exactly the routes that caravans had been following for 1,000 years. The Black Death was not an interruption of the Silk Road story. It was part of it as much as the silk, and the paper, and the stirrup, and the gunpowder. The most important thing the Silk Road produced is the hardest to name because it is not an object, or a practice, or a religion, but a habit of mind. The people who lived inside the network, the Sogdian merchants who learned 5 languages and spent their lives in transit, the Buddhist monks who walked from China to India and back, the OAAs, city dwellers who watched Zoroastrian, Manichaean, Christian and Muslim traders argue theology in their markets, developed a relationship to difference that the purely local world could not produce. They understood in a way that most of their contemporaries did not, that the world was larger than their own practices assumed, and that the people on the other side of the mountain believed things and ate things and built things that were worth knowing about. That understanding acquired not through philosophy, but through the daily experience of trade, is the foundation of every cosmopolitan value the modern world claims to hold. None of this was intended. The Yamna pastoralists who spread across the steppe following their herds were not trying to build the infrastructure of Eurasian commerce. The Bronze Age farmers who carried broomcorn millet westward through the Tian Shan Da foothills were not trying to create the conditions for a population explosion in medieval Europe. The Entorian monks who circa arrived silkworm eggs out of China in bamboo canes were not trying to end a 1,000-year monopoly on the world's most valuable fabric. The German goldsmith who adapted a winepress was not trying to trigger the Protestant Reformation, and each of them was doing the thing that the immediate pressure of their life required. The road that resulted from 10,000 such decisions was nobody's plan. It was everybody's consequence. In a freight yard in the Chinese city of Yeyu, trains are loaded several times a week with consumer goods and dispatched westward across Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, Poland, and Germany, arriving in European cities 18 days after departure. The route they follow passes within a few hundred kilometers of Samarkand, within sight of the Tian Shan Mountains through the Kazakh steppe, where the Yamaya first put a person on a horse 6,000 years ago. The train's contents, shoes, electronics, textiles, household goods, are different from the silk and jade and horses that once moved through the same terrain. The logic is identical. Someone on one end of the continent has something the other end wants. The distance between them is an obstacle to be engineered around. The relationship that results changes both of them in ways neither fully anticipates. The Silk Road never officially ended. It thinned, rooted, went underground, and re-emerged in different form. The maritime routes that Dama opened in 1498 were an extension of the same logic, not a replacement for it. The container ships that crossed the Indian Ocean, carrying Chinese-manufactured goods to European ports, are navigating waters that Arab and Indian and Swahili sailors had been working for 1,000 years before any Portuguese mariner rounded the Cape. The internet cables that carried digital commerce across the ocean floor follow in several cases the same geographic corridors that connected ancient oasis cities. Because the same logic that determined where caravans needed water also determines where Ursi cables need to make landfall. The topology of human connection is remarkably stable across millennia. The technology changes, the need does not. The road that was never planned, never named by the people who walked it, and never organized by any single power, left behind a world so shaped by its traffic that most of its inheritance is invisible, absorbed into the ordinary texture of daily life, yet present in every breakfast table and every algebraic formula and every printed page and every prayer. The people who built it. The Sagdian merchant adjusting his pack straps in a turfen courtyard at dawn. The Buddhist monk copying a text by lamplight in a Dun Huang cave. The Han soldier standing guard at a desert watchtower on the edge of the known world. Did not know they were building anything at all. They were just going where the need took them. One decision at a time. One across the widest piece of ground on earth.